So it is indeed a great honor for me to introduce our next speaker. I remember, in fact, I think it was in 93, maybe 92, but in my case it was in 93 that I discovered The Happiest Man Alive by Mary Dearborn. And it was a wonderful thing for me at the time to speed up on my knowledge about Henry, since I was talking again. I talked about him at the library every day with people coming by from all over the world to speed up on my knowledge. And I was especially happy about it being written by a woman. But so anyway, I'm sure that's the truth for many. At that time, the only other biography was Jay Martin's, and I think Ferguson came out actually almost at the same time as Mary's. So I wrote this down for you as an introduction. Mary is a biographer who doesn't just chronicle a life. She explores the forces that... Why is it so dark in here? I can't see what I've written. Oh, here it is. Okay. She explores the forces that shape it, the imagination and the contradictions that makes art possible. Over the years, you can agree or disagree with this, of course, but this is what I wrote. Over the years, she's written about some of the most formidable literary figures of the 20th century: Norman Mailer, Hemingway, Peggy Guggenheim, and of course Henry Miller. And Henry Miller was the happiest man alive. In her most recent work on Carson McCullers, she turns her lens towards questioning of gender identity and emotional survival, reminding us that the creative life is as much about confusion and yearning as it is about inspiration. There's a thread running through Mary's work that feels especially alive in this room. She has spent decades looking closely at what we might call the mythology of the manly writer, the performance of masculinity and freedom embodied by figures like Mailer, Hemingway, and Miller. Norman Mailer, a great admirer of Miller, once said that Tropic of Cancer gave him the permission to write without apology. But those myths of manhood and artistic freedom, so vital to the 20th century, are now being re-examined in the 21st. And few writers have guided and continues to guide that conversation with as much insight and generosity as Mary Dearborn. So because Mary reminds us that the truth and the art usually live somewhere in between virtue and vice, between rebellion and restraint, between what an artist dared to say and what he could barely admit to himself. It's in that middle ground, that messy, uncertain space, where the most honest work can get made, and where we can still find something of ourselves in these figures, even when their times and their manners no longer match our own. And Mary reminds us again that the truth and the art live somewhere in between. In our time, when the instinct is to simplify, to cancel, or to canonize, she asks us to stay a little longer with the ambiguity, to look at these men not as moral templates, but as human experiments, sometimes failures, sometimes revelations, always reaching for something real. So, as we explore Henry Miller's relevance in the 21st century, this tension between liberation and offense, between self-expression and self-awareness, there's no one better equipped to help us navigate that than Mary Dearborn. So Mary, will you help us to welcome Henry into the 21st century? And will you allow us in turn to warmly welcome you, dear Mary Dearborn?
Okay, thanks, Magnus. Wow. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming and to the conference's hosts and sponsors, the library, the Henry Miller Memorial Library, and the Journal Nexus, and Jim and Bill and Magnus, and all of you. What I'm really most grateful for, and this is written, so I hope you don't mind. Okay. Is better? What I'm most grateful for is a chance to revisit one of the most challenging, exciting, and rewarding times of my life, the research and writing of my biography of Henry Miller, the happiest man alive. When I started on the project, I was in my early 30s and still shaking the dust off my feet from the world of academia, from which I was a recent refugee. In fact, one of the greatest shocks of recognition I felt in reading Miller was his rapturous description of quitting Western Union, the infamous cosmodemonic telegraph company of Tropic of Capricorn and Rosy Crucifixion, when he was about the same age as I was then. Strolling down Broadway, watching his fellow workers scrambling about, what he called the rat race seemed not only crazy to him, but diabolical as well. I made a vow, he wrote, never to work for anyone again. I would become a writer or I would starve to death. Of course, I was setting forth as a biographer while Henry Miller was set. Looking back, I think I was impossibly naive. I'd written 2 books, but I had yet to contemplate what they call a cradle-to-grave biography. And while I knew all about library and archival research, I had little experience with journalistic sources, and I had only a vague conception of the logistic, geographical, and psychological demands of biography. I had a handsome advance. There used to be such a thing in publishing, and what seemed like all the time in the world. I'd recently moved to Brooklyn myself, and I was in love with the borough, intoxicated by all the sky that I could see after 10 years in the canyons of Manhattan. So I set out by concentrating on where Henry's life would take me. I got acquainted with my new home by tracking down all his many Brooklyn addresses, from the modest 3-story Driggs Avenue building to the once respectable address in Bushwick where his family moved when he was 10, then jumping ahead the elegant Remsen Street digs where June insisted they live, and to my favorite address, the basement apartment where Henry, June, and her friend Jean Kronsky had marathon talks around the gut table at the intersection of the aptly named Henry Street and Love Lane. In the late 80s, this was next door to a D'Agostino's. But I spent several hours in the basement of Brooklyn's Borough Hall, paging through books of records, following the movements of the Smurth family, since I had it on pretty good authority, or was it from that only intermittently reliable Tennessee Dick book, that June Mansfield's maiden name had been Smurth, not Smith. Armed with a telephone calling card, remember those? And a list of contacts I left for France. You know, how I thought I could just trip over there, and I had a little red dress and a blue jean jacket. Anyway, I was in search of, among other things, oh yes, something that seemed and subsequently turned out to be elusive, the so-called keyed copy of The Tropic of Cancer, which allegedly identified that motley cast of characters from Tanya, who was Bertha Strank, to Carl Perles, to Boris Michael Frankel. I somehow thought if I identified them, I would find them in the environs of Montparnasse. I never found that keyed copy, but Roger Jackson has provided the equivalent in an excellent essay on the subject in his bibliography. I had other people to look up, Maurice Gerodius, who took over publishing Miller in France after his father, Jacques Cahan, died. Oh, Madame Monray, who had almost nothing for me. Michael Neal, an interested book dealer who turned out to be an indispensable guide and a good friend. Georges Belmont, mysteriously known during the occupation as Roger Pelorson, who knew Miller in the 30s and renewed his friendship with him in the 60s when Henry visited Paris with his last wife, Hokie. These connections took me all over Paris and environs, though I have to admit I could not see Henry on those streets or in those cafes. An address in Louveciennes led me to the rundown, virtually unrecognizable house where Anais Nin and Henry had their trysts. Clichy, where Henry passed some not-so-quiet days and nights with Perles, had even less to offer me. Though on the Boulevard Clichy in town, I think I had them confused. At least I saw some prostitutes. Well, I met some wonderful people in Paris, some of whom actually knew Henry or knew someone who knew Henry. For the most part, I didn't find him there. A quick aside, I didn't visit Greece as I couldn't find anyone there with any information, though I think that I was trying to track down the mysterious Betty Ryan from the Villa Sera days, somewhere in that country. I remember a little blue pamphlet now that's called Betty Ryan, La Dame d'Andros. She remains elusive. Arguably, fans of the Colossus of Marassi will say I should have visited to soak up the atmosphere, since Miller's near mystical experience there completed a transformation of his character from the obsessional plant of the Brooklyn years and the clochard of Paris to the happy rock of his California period. But in those years, I had little interest in Miller's spiritual side, and in fact blamed it for much of what I saw as the sometimes sloppy writing of the New Directions books. But more on that in a little bit. Nor did I try to follow Miller's footsteps in America, or certainly not the circuitous route he took on the dispiriting, but in retrospect, hilarious trek he made around the country for the air-conditioned nightmare. Much of the American trail I'd stumbled across in the years to come in the course of researching other biographies. For example, when I was working on Mistress of Modernism, my biography of art collector Peggy Guggenheim, I was once again looking at researching the Bowling Green, Virginia estate of Caress Crosby, where her unlikely guests in the summer of 1940 were Henry and Anais, and also Salvador and Gala Dali, the sometimes surrealist writer and the surrealist painter did not hit it off. I needed to spend a lot of time in LA because that's where Henry's principal archive was. And though little trace would remain of his 2 years on Beverly Glen Boulevard, it was an important time in his life, as he was making the transition from a struggling urban would-be writer to becoming a struggling rural writer whose talent and output were admired, but who nonetheless could not make a living. Los Angeles was demanding and hectic. However much of a refuge was the greenhouse thatched with women's hair that he shared with fellow writer Gilbert Neiman and his wife, and where Henry found sympathetic souls who promised help with his material needs while he wrote. Thus began the years in Big Sur, which would be his home for the next 20 years. And of course, I went to Big Sur as part of my research. I'm going to pass over that time and his time in Big Sur and Carmel in part because we're here now, and words have never seemed to me adequate to express the Big Sur experience. Suffice it to say, I was pretty overwhelmed. When I much later read Jack Kerouac's 1952 account of his breakdown in Lawrence Ferlinghetti's isolated cabin in Bixby Canyon, the grandeur of the area's beauty and the relentless sound of the ocean's waves closing in on him and triggering wholesale terror, I could relate, perhaps better than I could, to Henry's wry, picaresque accounts of his life in the area in Big Sur and the Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch, which is one of my favorites of his books. In this untamed and untamable wilderness, Henry came as close to domestic bliss as he ever would, having 2 children with Lepska and a much easier time of it with fourth wife Eve, and ending up, of course, perversely in an incongruous suburban mansion in Pacific Palisades, an odd setting indeed for the end of this Brooklyn boy's life. I logged a lot of time in LA, where I located several people who had known Henry in his last years, and where, as you all know, the bulk of Henry's papers are housed. Now most archives are being digitized, and scans can be made available to the researcher often within a day. When I researched Miller, I had to use bulky reference books to find the other archives around the world that housed his material and write off to those repositories to see if they would send me copies. In Miller's case, at least once a week for several years, I would get a bulging manila envelope full of his Xerox letters and sit down and read them immediately like they were candy, before going back to them to work on them or take notes. So eager was I to learn every detail about Henry's life. Those archives with too much material to Xerox I had to visit in person, most notably UCLA and the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, but also Indiana University, Yale, and several others. Because most of what a biographer does is read other people's mail, which sounds like it's incredibly petty and grounded in gossip. While there's indeed plenty of that, correspondence not only recreates the texture of the subject's daily life, from his or her creative preoccupations to love affairs, to troubles with children, to financial woes or windfalls, and so on, it allows you to track their movements to establish some kind of chronology. Terrible headache, but very important if they're good enough to date their letters, or even if not. Henry was pretty good about dating, as I remember. Anyway, I'd read these to gather information about literary influences, the background of various works, establishing relationships in my subject's life, and gleaning information about their emotional life and childhood and adolescent histories. The archives of my latest subject, Harrison McCullough, had transcripts of 11 taped therapy sessions, a gold mine. Some archives are vast. Another of my subjects was Ernest Hemingway, whose letters are being collected in a decades-long project, already 6 volumes, and only up to 1936. He lived to 1961. It's estimated Hemingway wrote about 6,000 letters. I think Henry may have written almost as many. I'd love to know if anyone wants to make a guess. Certainly there are multiple volumes of collected letters, again, as you know, to and from everyone from Wallace Fowley to Emil Schnellock. It was not until I had been at the biography business for several years that I realized that much of the time the writer spent in his or her study, supposedly writing novels or plays or poems, was actually given over to writing letters. I'd say about 2 or 3 hours a day in most cases. And they also repeat themselves. If you ever remember writing postcards from, say, Paris, you'd repeat your stories, and then you'd hone them over time, making them a little better with each. And so you see that in your subjects, and you see it in Henry's letters as well. They become funnier or wiser or more elegant. Well, I should add that here that if letters describe events that are fodder for gossip or pass on gossip, and they often do, it's well to remember that there's nothing wrong with gossip. The biographer Phyllis Rose has written that gossip is nothing less than stories about relations of power, who's up, who's down in a marriage, for instance. It's really just storytelling. There's one quotation from her book, Parallel Lives, about 5 Victorian marriages, a book that's had a tremendous influence on me. It is, of course, one of life's persistent disappointments that a great moral crisis in my life is nothing but matter for gossip in yours. When I was researching Peggy Guggenheim, who spent decades in Venice, I called an American woman I'd been referred to, who was married to an Italian sculptor who supposedly knew reams about the Italian art scene and Peggy. And when I asked her what she had to say about Peggy, she answered, "Why, Mary, I have lots of things that I could tell you, but they'd all be gossip." I was speechless. So gossip is good. Henry Miller was a crack letter writer, which again, many of you know. What the collections don't reveal, the published collections, is what the letters look like. For example, the wide range of stationery he wrote on over the years, for he knew enough artists that he got free designs for letterhead. The ones I remember most, or saw most often, one was a vertical letterhead that had a nude there, and it was provided by Byrne Porter, and Henry's first name was hyphenated. Another that said simply Henry Miller, Big Sur, California, with an illustration by Bezalel Schatz. You don't see that very often. And you were just talking about another letterhead that I hadn't heard of. And anyway, and then the one I saw, I think the most, was from Ocampo Drive in Pacific Palisades, which was a design in typefaces, which had at the bottom of the page, printed in red, in Portuguese, the saying, "When shit has value, the poor will be born without assholes." I could have sworn that some letter had reproduced Staline's saying, "I piss on you all from a considerable height," but I could be wrong about that. Somebody tell me if I was right. But it wasn't an unmitigated pleasure reading Henry's letters. In one set of correspondence at the University of Texas, I opened an envelope from a female fan and a swatch of hair fell out, which I found on reading the letter was indeed pubic hair. I can only imagine the conversations the Texas archivists must have had as to whether they should leave the unsavory physical evidence in the envelope or remove it. But I think they made the right decision. It was really the only decision. Certain correspondence brought out the worst in Henry, or a bad time of his life, especially in times of great stress or misery. At UCLA, early letters to a young merchant marine friend, Harry Hershkovitz, who had moved back to New York City from Big Sur. I remember reading with a sinking feeling, eventually even with chills up and down my spine. The two men reviewed schemes to raise money for Henry, including ideas for patrons or simply scoping out people who might be hit up for funds. At one point, they discussed the idea of floating a rumor that Henry was dead so that the banned books could be published and without fear of prosecution, and then Henry could resurface after the books were out and praised. Most distressingly, though, Henry deputized Harry to find him a female companion, a bedmate who could also cook and clean, type his manuscripts, and generally ease his harsh existence in Big Sur. Henry sent wish lists of desirable characteristics. They discussed the relative merits of Gentile wives, for instance. And Henry recommended potential lays for Harry in the city. Eventually, Harry Hershkovitz zeroed in on a young woman fortuitously named June Lancaster, whose photographs satisfied Henry. Harry Hershkovitz then took June to bed in a kind of tryout, just to make sure. She passed muster, Harry praising her attractive, firm body. So she was shipped off to Henry, delivered to Jean Varder's place in Sausalito, where she was presented to Henry standing nude on a barrel with her hands over her head, draped in flower garlands. It didn't work out. The archives held all kinds of pleasant surprises as well. There was correspondence with Carson McCullers, who later became a subject of mine, with Langston Hughes, with Kerouac, with Sherwood Anderson. Generally speaking, however, Miller's correspondence resembled nothing so much as that of a diversified corporation, with activities on any number of fronts, most of them related to money. Miller, this most unmaterialistic of souls, was positively obsessed by money, understandably so, for the salient fact of his life, and his life's greatest irony was the ban of the so-called Paris books, his masterpieces, The Tropics and Black Spring. He was penniless despite the critical praise his works garnered, though he had countless fans and a broad swath of readers from a range of backgrounds. He couldn't make a living in his own country. His main publisher, James Laughlin, and his company, New Directions, the only one who could bring him a wider audience than that reached by the many small presses that published him, issued almost anything Henry gave him, no matter how inconsequential, which in turn did no good for his critical standing. The prohibition on U.S. publication of his best work was not only an irony in Miller's life, but also a tragedy, perhaps best expressed in the title of a 1944 pamphlet brought out by Byrne Porter, The Plight of the Creative Artists in the United States of America. Speaking of James Laughlin and Byrne Porter and the publishing history of Henry's books, brings me to the third subject I wanted to talk about, and that's the people in Henry Miller's life. Also, the people in the life of the biographer of Henry Miller. Simply put, I have never met such a wide variety of remarkable individuals in the course of my career as a biographer, and that's saying something. Just take his publishers alone. His first, Jack Kahan, the iconoclastic British Jew whose Obelisk Press published The Tropics, died in 1939, but his son, Maurice Gerodius, whose Olympia Press published such classics as The Ginger Man and Lolita, as well as Miller's Rosy Crucifixion and other titles in post-war Paris, and later on Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto. Gerodius appears in that film I shot Andy Warhol, because he was Valerie Solanas' publisher, and she shot Andy Warhol. didn't kill him. Anyway, Maurice proved himself to be, when I spent time with him in Paris in 1988, a charming raconteur who was usually in trouble, generally with the law, owing to financial matters. He told numerous stories about Miller in the 60s and also relayed some memories of Miller's interchanges with his father in the 30s. Maurice was the artist who created the crab on the first edition of Tropic of Cancer at the age of like 12. Vern Porter, who published Miller in the 40s, was a genuine eccentric whose Institute for Advanced Thinking, which he operated on the grounds of his rundown house in Belfast, Maine, and largely out of his own head, I visited frequently in the 1980s because Byrne always promised to tell me, among many other things, what Anais Nin was really like in bed. Byrne, I don't think he knew. Byrne was still working as a nuclear physicist when he first met Miller, though he left his job on the Manhattan Project after the atom bomb was detonated. Byrne had great hopes for publishing Miller, though he operated his press on a variant of the Ponzi scheme, not quite, and never brought in enough money for his most famous author. Though Byrne dabbled in any number of creative endeavors, he was one of the earliest practitioners of mail art. His life after Henry lacked the focus of his earlier years, and he eked out a precarious but not entirely unhappy existence. A roughly contemporaneous publisher of Miller's was Gershon Legman, another oddball who was the first to make Tropic of Cancer available in the US in the pirated edition, known as the Medusa edition, Medusa spelled with a V. My partner once noted that Vern Porter and Gershon Legman were eccentrics of a particular stripe. Both, when we met them, old men with great shocks of white hair, often clad in black turtlenecks with food and other debris down the front, living from hand to mouth, each poor, unrecognized, and bitter about it, while remaining astoundingly idealistic. There are many other sources who resembled them. Gershon received us in a mountaintop stone cottage in an olive grove, incongruously located in the south of France, promising vivid stories about Miller and New York in the 40s, a decade when Henry was hardly ever in New York. In Valbonne, near Nice, he continued to make contributions to the fields of folklore and the history of erotica while writing his magnum opus, an autobiography with the working title Peregrine Penis, which is now out. Like many of his ilk, Gershon was an unreconstructed male chauvinist, if they still use that term, who believed in traditional gender roles, repeatedly lecturing my partner to the effect that if he kept me pregnant, I would not have to travel around the world writing books, illogically overlooking my reason for being there. He also repeatedly accused me, because my last name matched the name of the Michigan town where Henry Ford had its automobile plant, of having had something to do with Ford's anti-Semitic screeds and the protocols of the elders of Zion. But then Gershon had long since rounded the bend past eccentricity. More presentable, but finally equally eccentric, was publisher and poet James Laughlin, with whom we spent a weekend in Norfolk, Connecticut, the home of New Directions, where he allowed me to explore his own archives containing scores of pages of correspondence with Henry. Though Laughlin, a genuine blue blood educated at Harvard, has emerged as a pivotal figure in literary modernism, publishing American writers as various as Marianne Moore, Elizabeth Bishop, Ezra Pound, and Allen Ginsberg. He was greatly impressed by the tropics and fundamentally in sympathy with Miller's views and his values, though he never managed to publish Miller's more risque titles, unwilling to offend the aged aunt who was bankrolling his operation. Finally, Barney Rossett, whose Grove Press finally dared to publish the banned books in this country, was an excellent source who became a friend. Another handsome man, all of Henry's publishers were handsome when younger. Well, Gershon, not so much. Roger, where were you? Barney had been married several times and indicated his loyalties early on by writing a college term paper titled Henry Miller versus Our Way of Life. He got a B-. When I met Barney, as financially impecunious as Byrne and Gershon and Maurice Gerodius, but operating on a much larger scale, he was being forced out of the press he'd founded and made famous by publishing Céline, Beckett, Jean Genet, and Ionesco, among many others. He's winding up full circle with an erotica press called Blue Moon Books. I half suspected Barney was helping me out because he wanted me to authenticate long after the fact the infamous Opus Pistorum, a book of erotica he published that he was claiming was authored by Miller. I kept mum. I'm leaving out Henry's other publishers, among them Noel Young, publisher of Capra Press, who was as urbane as James Laughlin and generously introduced me to, among others, Lepska, Henry's third wife. Noel was no eccentric, though he could match any of his colleagues in his fondness for wine and good talk. I am conspicuously not including Henry's most recent publisher, Roger Jackson, who's moving force behind this conference. Suffice it to say that all his publishers have viewed publishing Henry Miller as a kind of sacred calling and were thus excellent allies in my quest to tell Henry's stories. Beyond Henry's publishers, I met and interviewed a huge range of individuals who'd known Henry or had meaningful contact with him in some way. From Brenda Venus to Patrick Freiherr von Richthofen, that's right, the grandson of the Red Baron, I met an astonishing number of people whose lives touched Henry's. Many were enthusiasts or acolytes, some making a living through their interests, but most not. For Henry had fans, people who encountered the man in his writings and determined to follow him in some way, whether writing their own autobiographical romances or walking in his anti-authoritarian footsteps and leaving polite bourgeois society behind, if often only in the imagination. His friend Walter Lowenfels, who knew Henry in Paris, remarked on this quality in his friend. No other writer, he said, not Hemingway, not Eliot, not Fitzgerald, attracted followers as Henry did, with the sole exception of Walt Whitman. Whitman attracted farmers and soldiers and carpenters among men, while women crossed the ocean to convince him to marry them. Henry inspired a similar devotion, and the people whose lives he touched were a fiercely loyal and generous tribe whom I was honored to meet. Henry spent much of his life in search of interesting and unusual people to talk with about books, culture, philosophy, humanity, the world at large, people who could enrich his life and connect him with other like-minded people. This was the great compensation he sought for the poverty, obscurity, and artistic frustration he had to endure so much of the time. It was what enabled him to be always merry and bright and call himself the happiest man alive. Each of the biographies I've written has been an experience, and I mean that in its truest, not the cliched sense. The people I meet in the course of writing each one, from sources to enthusiasts to cranks, populate their own universe. For however many years I work on a book, I lived in its world, seeing mostly its inhabitants. Some of these have been more salubrious or enjoyable than others. I have made lifelong friends through each of these projects. One of the less savory among these worlds was Norman Mailer's, incidentally, a huge Miller fan, as someone just said. But from that world, I came away with excellent friends, including 2 of his 6 wives and a longtime mistress, all of whom enriched my life. When I worked on Peggy Guggenheim, I entered into a world a little more glamorous than some of the others, people with artists, museum curators, and Peggy's old boyfriends. I learned a tremendous amount about the art world, which was entirely new to me. With that book, I was able to fulfill a long-held fantasy. I lived in a loft in New York City at the time, and it was an excellent party space. And I invited every denizen of the Peggy Guggenheim universe to a big party. Distant relatives of hers came, artists who had exhibited in her galleries, gay men who'd stayed with her in her Venice palazzo, male admirers and ex-lovers. They met each other, and a crucial part of my fantasy, they talked together. So when Bill Ashley contacted me about this conference and asked me to speak, I accepted enthusiastically because I suspected this weekend would be something like that excellent party. I looked forward to revisiting Henry Miller and his world. This gathering to me represents an opportunity to talk about his life and work and what he has to offer readers in the 21st century. I hope that a lot of good talk will ensue, and I hope to be part of the conversation. But I also see this convention as one big party for those of us who populate the Miller universe, a chance for us to meet each other and to exchange our thoughts. I'm honored to be part of the Henry Miller universe, and I want to close by noting what a wonderful world it is. Thank you.